Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab and the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
And I'm Justin Tewald. A quick welcome to our Chinese-speaking audience. 欢迎收听道可道. Okay, Richard, so today's topic is, well, I should say our featured passage for today is chapter 80 of the Daodejing. And the simple way to think of that, instead of just committing the number to memory, is to think of it as the one that describes a kind of Daoist utopia. It describes a life that seems to be simple, agrarian, without the use of advanced technology, quite peaceful. And I think it sort of stands out among passages in the Daodejing because the Daodejing is otherwise, I think it's safe to say, a pretty abstract text, right? A lot of the points are made in relatively abstract language. But this one paints a picture, right? It gives us even some concrete details, kind of poetic and evocative details about what life is like in this ideal Daoist state.
Yeah, definitely. And there's so much sort of metaphysics that sort of flows through the Daodejing. Sometimes you you have to read it a fair number of times. But this one is a bit more, I don't know, I suppose.
Concrete.
Down to earth. Down to earth. That's the phrase I was looking for. And there is this kind of criticism, as we'll see in the background, about new technological advancements. So there's already this kind of concern, which I think we still have today, about the way that new technology and advancements will destroy certain features of our minds, maybe. There's this line from Plato's Phaedrus where there's this worry about how the written word will destroy our memory because we're no longer forced to memorize things, and we're just going to, we can just bypass the difficulties of memorizing, which maybe one worry about that is you don't really absorb the material until you've really spent the time to integrate it and to really learn for yourself what exactly the text is saying. And of course, now, we're speaking in 2025, we have so much advancements. I don't know, maybe if people listen to this in 5 years, in 2030, I wonder what's going to happen with AI advancements. But certainly now we have this constant companion called the cell phone and social media, and we're so much in the digital virtual world. And I guess the one worry I have today is that with this AI development, students are going to rely so much on it, and they're not going to be able to develop for themselves the power, the capacity to read and think and write. So that's a serious worry for me. And as we'll see, there's a kind of underlying worry of that in the text as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, that is a big worry. That's, in fact, one of those worries, I don't know, sort of like nuclear annihilation or total environmental collapse that is so almost existential for me. And just like those other existential worries, I therefore try to set it aside,
Yeah, too much to handle.
Yeah, I confess I do.
Have you heard this, Justin, that even at Ivy League universities, students are having a hard time reading books? So like many professors have complained that they can't really assign books anymore. And these are like top elite institutions. That's very sad and troubling for me.
I have heard that. And, I teach at a university that also draws very, very good students, University of Hong Kong. Not only that, but the people who tend to major in philosophy or double major in philosophy and something else tend to be readers. So I've always felt quite fortunate. More recently, since I've started teaching at HKU, I've felt quite fortunate that I've had these students who are actual readers, who actually spend time reading books and are willing to put in the work to understand old texts that don't kind of cater to a contemporary audience. So I'm told that even these students are slipping a little bit in their reading ability, but I have to say I haven't really seen them. I worry about my attitude on all of this, Richard. I think these are very serious concerns, that we have this constant companion that's a source of distraction in the form of our cell phone. We have social media, we have AI doing our work for us. But I just confess I haven't really thought it through. And in fact, I tend to think, gosh, there are experts in the cognitive science, the relevant cognitive science and psychology, who are working on these problems. Just like I imagine there are people who do more teaching than I do and are busy figuring out how we can revise the teaching of philosophy and the sort of assessment of philosophical work and understanding in light of the age of AI. I do like this reference to the Phaedrus, I don't know how you pronounce it. It's somehow to the detriment of people that they now rely on writing for access to ideas, literature, and so on. Because I think he says something like, it used to be that when they needed to recall some text, they recalled it from inside, and now they rely on external markings, something like that. I think there's something analogous going on with respect to AI, so far as I can tell, and that is that people used to rely on their own understanding of a particular problem or issue, and now they rely on AI even for understanding. And of course, what we mean by understanding is up for grabs. There's some sort of argument about what it means exactly to understand. But I think most people would agree that when you understand, say, a philosophical problem, or an economic problem or a historical issue or something, you don't just know the facts, the relevant facts, but you know the reasons for those facts, right? And for me, the most satisfying kind of speculation and discussion that you can have with someone, or just have for your own sake, is that kind where you don't just know the relevant facts, but know the reasons for them. So if I were to be relying on AI to provide me with that, that's a way of saying I would be relying on external markings, so to speak, in order to understand the reasons for the facts that are, or the relevant issues, the issues that are really important to me. So that would be tragic. Yeah. And I don't know what to, I mean, like I say, it's such an existential problem that I'm kind of reluctant to face it squarely, although I should. I mean, I guess I can say this much. I've always been really grateful that I happened to grow up in a period and happened to get all my education, all my formal education, that is straight through the end of graduate school, before smartphones really took off. So smartphones didn't come around until I was a few years, really. They didn't become ubiquitous until a few years into my kind of professional life. So I went through undergraduate school and graduate school entirely before the cell phone era. And in fact, for most of that era, you still had to dial up in order to check your email, which also has a way of discouraging people from spending lots of time on the internet. So that means that I grew up in this time when if you were bored and you had some work to do that involved reading, like, an assignment, homework, or you've just, promised yourself you'd read a book, there were fewer temptations. There were fewer ways of distracting you from your reading that were close at hand. And as a result, I just sort of formed both the habits and the ability to relish being deeply, deeply immersed in a book, in a way, sort of achieving that state of mind that you can only achieve when you've been sort of reading and thinking about the arguments and ideas so much, so deeply, and for so long, that you now begin to see new connections, that you're now sort of caught in the web. And that way, that kind of state of mind that I feel like I experienced again and again ever since I started doing lots and lots of close reading in high school and university, that is so valuable to me that I, continue to relish it. It just so happens to be useful for the kind of work that we do. Anyway, I sometimes regret that this younger generation may not have enough exposure to that sort of experience and state of mind to have developed the same habits and thus be able to resist the temptation. So to this day, I think we've talked about flying before, since I do a lot of flying these days.
Right.
To this day, you have the option of subscribing, paying for kind of internet subscription while you're on the plane. And I never accept that offer because I sort of relish the opportunity to read a book or something that I've been meaning to read for a long time in a sustained way, My sister, I have to say, this is a little off the topic, but she had the foresight right around the time that cell phones were becoming more popular and, we started to see widespread use of cell phones. She had the foresight to sort of commit to raising her children without many of the distractions that we now associate with modern technology. So her kids, her two daughters, my nieces, didn't have regular access to the internet. They couldn't watch more than, I forget what, if it was like half an hour of YouTube videos or 15 minutes or something in a given day. And they finally got access to smartphones, shortly before high school age, so that they could at least have some capacity to interact with other kids their age, and be kind of conversant in some way with the technology that they'll need. But up until then, they were basically being raised the same way that I was long ago. And it's amazing. Like, they're super creative kids, or maybe I should say young adults, And I guess the only consolation I can find in all of this is that it seems like it's still possible to develop the habits that I think are necessary to be able to resist the kind of worst temptations and thus the worst effects, really, of technologies that constitute the greatest threats in the age of distraction that we live in now. Yeah.
Yeah, I have some hope. I think people are starting to realize the harms of social media. So there is this movement to ban it from all schools, especially Jonathan Haidt, who I'm sure some of the listeners are familiar with. He's really pushing hard for this, and he thinks the empirical data just clearly demonstrates the harms of social media and the use of smartphones for teenagers especially. And also, I do think people will realize, no, we can't just completely depend on AI, even if it becomes so much better than us for everything, because, right, there is this profound joy of learning things for yourself.
Yeah.
And imagine, like, you start talking to other people and they cannot really hold a conversation about any important intellectual matters. All they can do is just ask, ChatGPT. I mean, I think people will realize that's a sad state. And I think maybe we will realize that, such dependence isn't actually good. It's robbing human beings of a certain potential and a certain important part of, what it is to be a human at all, with a mind and an intellect and capacity for some independent thought. So I think maybe in the beginning, people will be, they are attracted, but over time, maybe there'll be some corrections. So I have some hope for that. Although I think meanwhile, the use of AI will be continuing, and I do think too many people will depend too much on it. Although I'm a little bit torn. The AI stuff can be incredible. Like, you can learn about almost anything. It is a marvelous device in some way. But I guess we should always think about it as a tool. So if you think about it always as a tool, then you realize, just like any tool, it can be used well or badly. And what you need is some wisdom and certain sense of priorities to be able to use it well, that in a way that benefits you.
Yeah, you're right. So I think we both have enough of a historical perspective to be mindful of the fact that when there have been these other developments, such as writing, which Plato mentions, there have been these curmudgeons who kind of like doomsayers, right, who have been convinced that it's sort of the beginning of the end. And it turned out to be a net plus in the end. And so maybe the same will be true for AI. I have to be mindful of that fact. That's true.
It is very, very, a strange development. And we don't quite know where it's all headed.
Yeah, but you're right. There are a number of ways in which I think perhaps if you rely on AI to do all of your thinking for you, it's still apparent to people in their conversations, perhaps just in their own attempts to muddle through a problem, that they become so reliant on AI that they can't do some of the basic work that they need for basic human goods. And so, maybe that will be somehow tangible enough or clear enough to people themselves that they'll be motivated to use these tools in better ways and maybe structure their days so that they aren't constantly at the beck and call of their phone.
Now, we've been talking a lot about the technological advancements, but of course, there's a point to all this too, because we're going to discuss this very famous passage from the Daodejing, chapter 80, and you've already kind of started discussing it earlier. There's a picture that develops from that passage, as I think the listeners will see, that offers a kind of a certain kind of utopian ideal of a small community. There's almost a kind of anti-modern kind of thought here. But really, as I understand it, the ultimate question is, what is it to flourish? And the questions it raises are quite profound. Like, what would it be to live in a smaller, quieter life, and one that, isn't moving at this rapid speed of modern life? And how would life look in such a, radically different form? And I think those are good questions to ask.
Yeah, it's useful. It's kind of amazing when people hear that there is a passage which seems to be opposed to innovation and technology in the Daoist canon, because you think, well, gosh, wasn't the Daoist canon written long before technology as we know it was invented? But in fact, it's very likely that the text was written in the Warring States period, at a time when states were consolidating power, when what were once just a kind of plethora of mini small states with their own communities that were relatively independent of each other, at least according to a certain count of history that the Daoists seem to endorse, those were being replaced by these, sort of gobbled up in a way, by these larger states that were consolidating power through war and political scheming, the worst kind of political scheming, the kind that involves, the direct use of intimidation. So, there's this kind of vision of perhaps a utopian vision. Maybe we'll have a chance to discuss how utopian it is, of life as the Daodejing at least presents it, and not just the life of individuals, but a kind of social organization, a way for communities to organize themselves and to live in relative harmony with one another. And it contrasts perhaps with other schools of thought, Confucian and Moist ideals of reform and governance, just at least insofar as it suggests that the best way to live is by not having ambitions, withdrawing from the accoutrements of modern civilization, rejecting even things like reading and writing. Yeah, and it seems like perhaps weapons of war were developing and other kinds of technology, perhaps even things like better boats and carts, better plows, perhaps, that were changing the ways of life of people even in that day.
Yeah, and the Warring States period, as I recall, I think during that period, about 5% of the entire population of China were destroyed through warfare. Something like that is what I've read.
Yeah.
And if you think about it today, so what, we're at about 8 billion in the world. So that would be around 400 million people dying.
Yeah.
It's kind of unfathomable brutality and loss and violence. So one thought that I had was that the writers of the Daodejing must have been quite dismayed by the atrocious warfare that's, just always continuing on, and just vying for power and territory must have been very unsettling to these people.
Yeah, no doubt. In fact, I would say that it looms large in a way that modern readers sometimes forget in all of the classical Chinese texts, that basically they see themselves as writing in a context where warfare is the problem. Sometimes they talk about disharmony and discord and such, but disharmony and discord is so terrible precisely because it brings about this horrific outcome, which is warfare. Yeah, so I think that points to what we're taking to be the principal topics that we're going to discuss in connection with this passage today. One is pretty obviously utopianism in Taoism, this idea that we can have a kind of ideal society, and then utopianism is often taken to be the view not just that there is some imaginable ideal society, but that it's actually worth aspiring toward. It's actually worth, working to try to instantiate or bring it about in some way. So one question we'll be asking is that true of the Daodejing? But then I think another point that will be quite relevant, perhaps even to the discussion that we had about technology just now in our own lives, which is how much ambition or desire for lives that are better than ours, that have more conveniences, right? And that kind of thing should factor in to, we might say, the collective aspirations of a people, and how much should societies be governed by their ambition to create better lives for themselves. So, those will be the topics that we discuss in conjunction with Daodejing, otherwise known as Lao Tzu, Chapter 80, after the intermission.
All right, so we are back, and we are looking at Chapter 80 of the Daodejing, sometimes referred to as the Lao Tzu, because once upon a time it was attributed to a single author named Lao Tzu, although now most scholars think it was compiled over time by multiple writers. It dates back to around 4th century BCE, and it's one of the central texts of early Taoism, along with the Zhuangzi, which we've also explored in this podcast.
Yeah, and this particular chapter, which, by the way, is the second to last chapter, the Daodejing is a 81-chapter text. It stands out in a number of ways. I think I mentioned already, it's the kind of one concrete imagistic chapter that gives us a relatively kind of textured picture of the life that it recommends. So it stands out in that way. It's also influential. I mean, there are some lines in the chapter which appear in other Taoist literature, including chapter 10 of the Zhuangzi, which is also a kind of utopian passage, a chapter about kind of Daoist Utopia. So we're going to read that passage shortly. Sometimes we've used this phrase, which we borrow from P.J. Ivanhoe in his translation of the Daodejing. His introduction to that translation, he describes the social ideal in early Taoism as a primitive agrarian utopia. If you don't like this word primitive, we could call it a simple agrarian utopia. And the idea seems to be something like, these people living in relatively small communities without taking advantage of the latest in technology or tools, without even an ability to read or write. It's an important thing. We'll see a hint, a clue that that's the view shortly. And seemingly with no interest in trading with other states or adventure, exploring. So that's the kind of agrarian utopia that the Daodejing seems to recommend. So I myself read this chapter as a pretty consistent exploration of not just a primitive agrarian utopia, but of what life would look like if we weren't even concerned about making lives better for ourselves. That is, if we weren't even thinking about what would it be like if only I could have, fill in the blank, a better job, more income, or what have you. In English, we have this expression, the grass is always greener on the other side. And if we take the other side to refer to other communities or countries, then that seems to be an expression that captures the sentiment that the chapter 80 of the Daodejing is trying to avoid, is trying to sidestep. It's trying to show us people who don't have that problem, that kind of envy of people living on the other side. By the way, there's a Chinese expression which I think comes even closer to the sentiment in chapter 80. In Chinese, it's 外国的月亮比较圆. In English, it translates as the moon in other countries, in countries abroad, is comparatively or relatively round, which is a way of saying kind of more perfect than it is here. So the chapter seems to be asking, what if we just stopped thinking about ways of making our lives better, stop worrying about whether we could have better technology, whether we could have a better life, better quality of life in various ways, stop comparing ourselves to people living abroad, so to speak, or living on the other side of the fence, depending on which idiom you choose. And in fact, you're so distance yourself from those ambitions and those worries about improving your own life that you might even have tools which could save you some labor, some sweat and toil, and yet you would have very little interest in using them. You could be within earshot of these other communities and have very little interest in visiting them. And the result would be something like much less competition, including that form of competition that's most terrible and horrific, namely warfare. That seems to be the kind of the big picture sort of motivation for this depiction of the Daoist Utopia in chapter 80. So I'll read the passage, the whole chapter from beginning to end. We're using the Philip J. Ivanhoe translation. So here it is. Reduce the size of the state. Lessen the population. Make sure that even though there are labor-saving tools, they are never used. Make sure that the people look upon death as a weighty matter and never move to distant places. Even though they have ships and carts, they will have no use for them. Even though they have armor and weapons, they will have no reason to deploy them. Make sure that the people return to the use of the knotted cord. And here we add, parenthetically, that this is a way of saying return to a time before people had reading and writing. They used knotted cords. Traditional commentaries say they used knotted cords for administrative work. So governments relied on knotted cords to kind of keep records and send orders to people back before people could just read their instructions, read Chinese characters and write them. I'll keep reading. Make their food savory, their clothes fine, their houses comfortable, their lives happy. Then, even though the neighboring states are within sight of each other, even though they can hear the sounds of each other's dogs and chickens, their people will grow old and die without ever having visited one another. And that's it. That's the passage.
Oh, great. And since this is a little bit of a longer passage, I think we're going to try to break down our conversation and discussion into 4 sections. So we're going to label these, and we'll go through the passage again as a whole. We're going to label the sections as political minimalism, technological and social restraint, contentment and simplicity in daily life, radical localism, and peace. So this first section, which we're going to call political minimalism, had the following first 2 lines of the passage. So it says, reduce the size of the state and lessen the population. Now, this suggests that ideal governance should avoid expansion, it seems, and it stands in sharp contrast to Maoist political theory. We've discussed, of course, Mozi, another extremely important classical Chinese thinker, and the Maoist movement, which considers a large, well-ordered population as a fundamental good. Populousness is one of the basic fundamental benefits. Now, what I was wondering is this a response to Maoism there? I wasn't entirely sure myself if we know about the dating of these texts, because I think both texts, both the Daodejing and the Mozi, dates back to roughly around the 4th century BCE. But maybe the ideas were sort of in the air. Maybe it was part of the culture, even if the text had not been fully established. So do you know anything about that, Justin?
Yeah. Well, I think this is what we can say about, first of all, I should say it's a good instinct to look for foils, for philosophical adversaries in these texts, because oftentimes the Daodejing has a kind of coherent philosophical position in mind. Sometimes that position is Confucianism or kind of what we might call traditionalism, or sometimes it's maybe it's Moism. So it's plausible that it could be responding to Moism. As I recall, this chapter does not appear in the Guodian version of the Daodejing, which is the oldest, roughly 300 BCE version.
Mm-hmm.
But it does appear in the Mawangdui, a version of it, kind of variant of it, which is more like, what is it, 2nd century?
These are, by the way, for the listeners, like fairly recent excavations, right? That which has an amazing story that we should talk more about at length. But we discovered these like ancient, bamboo strips of the Daodejing, and it dates back so long. And
bamboo and silk.
Yeah, bamboo and silk, and they uncovered it in like tombs and cave, right? There's a couple of different versions too.
Yes. Yeah, it's very exciting for people who want to know basically what we have for a long time, the so-called received versions of the classical Chinese texts. But in the last, a few decades, maybe now several decades, they've been discovering earlier versions of these texts in tombs. And that is a great source of fun for people who want to know what the original text said. And sometimes looking back at the older versions helps resolve some ambiguities in the received versions. So yeah, sorry to kind of make reference to it, but yeah, I just wanted to mention that this chapter seems to be a chapter that was not in the excavated texts that have been found, but in ones that come from roughly the 2nd century BCE, I should add, before the Common Era. So I think the Mawangdui was sealed in 168 BCE. Yeah, so anyway, you say, was that at a time when Moist political theory would have come along? Certainly, yes. But I think we could say even more safely, we could take fewer risks and just say, this was a widespread view that it was better to have a kind of burgeoning population in your state, to have more people. The Moists invoke this populousness, as a basic good because it seems to be something like common sense. I mean, there's a chapter in the Moist text, the Mozi, where the argument goes like this. It says, well, let's say you want to be a benevolent person on behalf of the entire world. Well, what would a benevolent person who's working for the good of the entire world want for the world? Roughly what a benevolent person who's working for the good of their family would want for their family, which is more people. So it seems like back then it was just assumed that families are better off when they're larger, when they have more people, and states are better off when they're larger and have more people. And it seems like a long time between now and then in that respect, because people don't take it for granted now that they want large families, large states, and large world population. So then it seems like it's just sort of taken to be common sense. I think there's a way of reading this text as a very radical one that's contravening the principles of common sense in all kinds of interesting ways. And that's the reading of the text that I'm most tempted by. Well, there are a lot of traditional commentators that try to downplay the radicalism, but I think, at least for the sake of argument, I'm going to say today we should face it squarely. And it's saying, yes, reduce the size of the state. You actually, contrary to what everyone thinks and assumes, a state is better off with fewer people and having smaller borders. And by the way, I just want to say there are analogies, even though we no longer just take it for granted that every family wants to have as many kids as possible. I've noticed that basically every person I've ever known in business works in a company that aspires to be bigger, to take more market share. And even departments, like every philosophy department I've ever been involved in, it's just funny. It's almost like an ineluctable law of human nature or something that they want to be bigger. They'd love to have more
hiring lines.
Yeah. And it's worth asking, why? What do we really gain by increasing?
To be honest with you, I've wondered that a fair number of times. So maybe I have imbibed the Daoist spirit in some way.
Yeah.
Like for what end, Why do we need these extra lines? In fact, actually, we might be heading for more and more trouble the more we expand.
Yeah.
And in fact, isn't that basically how every single empire in history ended up crumbling? Because they tried to expand too fast.
Yeah. Right. Or they're in some sense, they tried to have more control, more dominance, wider hegemony than the sort of social connections, the social capital, the political means available to them allowed, Yeah, and then similarly, maybe a philosophy department or an academic department is better off with a small community of people who have a great deal of camaraderie because they know each other well, rather than being kind of semi-strangers who see themselves more as work colleagues than as friends or allies in this shared project.
Yeah, you're like a real estate agent, and you just happen to be working in the same building.
Yeah, exactly. So that's just the first two lines of this passage. Reduce the size of the state, lessen the population. And that's the section that we're calling political minimalism. The next section, section 2, we're calling technological and social restraint. And I'll read that one. Here it is. Make sure that even though there are labor-saving tools, they are never used. Make sure that the people look upon death as a weighty matter and never move to distant places. Even though they have ships and carts, they will have no use for them. Even though they have armor and weapons, they will have no reason to deploy them. Make sure that the people return to the use of the knotted cord. Okay, so again, the knotted cord is a reference to ways of keeping records and conducting business, certainly government business, maybe contracts, by putting knots in string, maybe to count things or maybe to provide instructions, different kinds of knots perhaps. There's a lot of speculation about what this is. There are other classical texts, including the I Ching, the Book of Changes, that make reference to this early state of civilization where government business was conducted with knotted cords. And so it seems like it's supposed to be a pre-literate society. While we're talking about sort of textual issues, I should at least mention this. I don't want to bore the readers who don't care about the finer points of the kind of philological issues in the old text. But this line that's being translated as, make sure that even though there are labor-saving tools, they are never used. That line can be read lots of different ways. So you'll look at different translations and see wildly different interpretations of it. This is the Ivanhoe translation of the Daodejing, chapter 80. And I like the Ivanhoe translation, which accords with one of the two sort of consensus positions that I've noticed most contemporary scholars prefer. Starting around the 80s, 90s, we started to see most interpreters coalescing around two interpretations of the line. But what it says quite literally is something like, instead of labor-saving tools, it says the tools of companies of 10 or 100 people, or the tools of tens or hundreds of people. And then there are sort of two schools of thought about what that is really meant to mean. Some have this kind of militaristic reading where they read this word tool, which is chi, by the way, Qi, as referring to military tools. So they're kind of looking at the line in context of the whole passage, which does talk about weapons and arms and seems to be talking about the advantages of peace and so on, and suggesting that the tools are the military tools of military companies, units of tens or hundreds of soldiers. But then the other interpretation that Ivanhoe opts for is that when it refers to the tools of tens or hundreds of people, it's essentially referring to tools that do the work of tens or hundreds of people, that like where with just one tool you can accomplish what 10 people without the tool would accomplish, or 100 people without the tool would accomplish. When you put it that way, it's rather striking because it's suggesting that you could save yourself a lot of labor by using these tools. And yet, according to the text, they have these tools. Isn't that interesting? It's not like they don't have the tools. They have them, but they never use them.
Right. Why have it then? Yeah, I did wonder about that.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I've wondered about that too. And sometimes we've talked a lot about this line in class. I mean, I'd say like every third time I teach my classical Chinese philosophy course, the students get really interested in this line. And I mean, at the very least, we can say what's interesting about the chapter is it's suggesting it's self-aware of the fact that it's talking about a utopian state of life that maybe once existed, but would have to be reinstantiated, would have to be brought back. And so I think it's assuming that, of course, people already live in societies that have these labor-saving devices. And now they have to kind of voluntarily give them up, So it's not saying go back in time before these tools were invented. It's at least that realistic. It's at least making that concession to realism that you can't go back in time. Yeah, that's one interpretation. But another one is maybe it's somehow, I don't know, advantageous to have the tools around just as a reminder of of your principled stance, of your commitment to your rejection of modern technology. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so I guess the way that P.J. Ivanhoe reads this, by thinking of the tools as not just military tools, but more general tools, it does make it even more radical. So the idea that, right, you have a tractor, let's say, that can really do the work of 100 people.
Yeah.
How it just seems absurd, I think, to a lot of people that you would just never use it. Why would you toil away when you don't have to? Yeah, and I guess we'll be getting into more and more into that issue. One quick thought that maybe we'll explore more later is, I think you've mentioned this maybe already, Justin, which is But once you're down this path, this attitude of wanting to create more and more abundance, then there's just never going to be a stop. So if you're once you're just on that ride, the train will keep going. And so I guess maybe the Daodejing is saying, look, you got to cut it off at this earlier point, not to just keep going down this rabbit hole. Something like that.
Yes. I want to agree with two things, the two key points you just made there, Richard. First of all, it seems like I've never actually asked, it's funny, we both know PJ Ivanhoe well, but I've never asked him myself what motivated him to translate this line this way. But you said maybe he likes to just read it in this more radical way. I think that's right. I mean, the less radical way is to read these tools as tools of military troops, and that's less radical because everyone can get behind this idea that like endless warfare is a bad thing. I mean, it's not just the Daoists, like pretty much everyone is opposed to endless warfare. And so it's all the more sort of radical, striking, revolutionary in a way to suggest that actually people should be giving up these devices that they could use to save themselves time, sweating and toiling in the fields, And again, just at least for the sake of argument, I'm going to run with the more radical reading of this passage in our discussion today. So, and then, yes, you say, there is this idea, I think that's right, that basically in the Taoist texts, certainly in chapters like this one, there's a worry that once you've opened the door to wishful thinking and yearning for a better life, you've basically opened the door to a life and a state of mind, we might say, a state of yearning where dispositionally you're never going to be satisfied, a kind of insatiable state of mind. And that's because you may actually get this better quality of life. You may actually adopt some tools that save you some time and give you more leisure. You may adopt some sort of, you may acquire furniture and such that makes you more comfortable. And yet you'll then quickly find yourself yearning for even more, right? And so it's better to sort of be content with what you have. Yeah.
Right. That's the classic hedonic treadmill, which psychologists have noted happens to all of us, right? You just get used to the new thing that you get, and then your happiness just goes back to this normal baseline setting. And so even though you think, oh, well, once I have that, then I'll be happy. But no, there'll be another thing. You'll want the nicer car or the even more labor-saving tool. The other quick thought I had was when I read this passage, I do think about the Amish. And they're actually only about 30 minutes from where I live right now in Indiana. And so we've went down there and you can buy a lot of amazing furniture and they're all handcrafted. They're a little expensive, but they're excellent. And if I had more money, I would buy them. But they're just so well done. And you could watch them make it too. So they're making it by hand,
Yeah.
And I did wonder if, I don't know, maybe this isn't the idea that was in the passage itself. But yeah, there's something also about like not using tools, but like making things using your internal resources, or maybe kind of the old fashioned way, and I've wondered if maybe there was a thought like that, if you rely too much on these external instruments, right, you're not able to really connect with the activity or work.
Yeah. Gosh, maybe the idea is that you'll be alienated from the products of your labor,
I think there was a famous philosopher who, let's call him Carl. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I know. Yeah. Carl K.M. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, anyway, it's not crazy, I think, to think that maybe the Taoist texts cherish a certain relationship to the things that you live with. Maybe it's not so much the products of your labor, but just like the things that you live with and among. If it's the fruit of your own work by your own hand, rather than something that you acquired through expedient means, that's all the better. Yeah. You're more at home with those things that were made by hand. Yeah. Another thing I like to sometimes say, I don't know if this is helpful, is I find that although the texts don't always make it explicit, there's a kind of deep critique of acquired desires that runs through a lot of the historical Chinese texts, especially the Taoist and Buddhist ones. And when I say acquired desires, I mean desires. I think everyone kind of knows what I mean when I say this. Most people have had thoughts about the difference between the desires that come sort of built into us as human beings and the desires that we've acquired. So, we all have a desire for food. You can't help but have the desire to drink liquids when you're thirsty and have food when you're hungry and so on. But to desire a particular piece of candy or some novel toy that you see an advertisement on television or while surfing the internet, those are acquired desires. You see them especially in the way like young children maybe react to commercialization, to advertisements. And Acquired desires are interesting because, according to this kind of deep critique that I find to be implicit in a lot of early texts, the basic idea is that when it comes to satisfying those acquired desires, say for like a new piece of candy that you've just now discovered exists, the satisfaction of the desire in terms of its kind of phenomenology, how it feels to you, is not that different from the elimination of a desire, right? Like basically what happens when you get the desire satisfied is you stop craving it, Maybe there's a little bit of pleasure, at the moment of satisfaction or something, but it's superficial and not long lasting, right? And so then when you think about it that way, it's easy to raise questions about the whole point of acquiring the desire in the first place. It seems like when you acquire new desires, the net effect is just to bring lots of frustration, right? Like sort of lifelong frustration if you never satisfy the desire, which often happens. Or anyway, lots and lots of frustration followed by just the elimination of the desire if you do somehow manage to satisfy the desire, get the object of your desire, get the new candy or what have you. And so either way, it's a net negative, right? Because you have lots of experience of frustration with very little upside. And if you take that basic picture to be right, then I think it helps lay the groundwork for a pretty powerful argument against labor-saving tools and learning to read and write. It's funny because the hardest features of this utopia to swallow are basically the rejection of labor-saving tools and education. But I do think that if you kind of bear that idea in mind, that most acquired desires come at a net loss for the reasons I just gave, that's certainly not sufficient to provide a complete knockdown, drag-out argument for rejecting the use of labor-saving tools and refusing to learn to read and write. But I think you can begin to see why that view would be appealing.
Yeah, the reading and writing part is tough, especially for people like us who are academics and we're buried in books and we've come to relish them. And we're also teaching these books to students, and there is a kind of beauty to them. And we do think it enriches their lives. But, maybe to be somewhat sympathetic, I mean, vast majority of human beings have never been able to read and write. And maybe we would say, well, that was unfortunate and they were limited. And isn't it a good thing that, there's higher literacy rates and all that? And I guess intuitively, I would say yes. But those people throughout human history, I mean, they could have had extraordinarily rich lives. They were still able to, perceive and have a human relationship. So there is still like extremely important human goods that they could have realized in their lives. And as, I think that oldest, Harvard psychological study on happiness shows, they do say it really is human bonds and relationships, or the quality of them, that seems to have the most enduring, lasting, and important effects on your happiness. That's the number one thing that, from what I understand, basically every single psychological study shows is the most fundamental to well-being. So maybe even there, I guess I would still defend reading and writing just because, it develops our human intellect. And there's also kind of a beautiful novels really move us and kind of expand us in different ways. So I'm not sure if I can quite agree, but so.
Right. I'm motivated to read this chapter as charitably as possible, so I'm tempted to defend it, but I nevertheless can say it's far too late for me and probably for a lot of people listening to this podcast. We're spoiled. We've already learned to read and write.
So once we're in it, in that world, then it's hard to kind of move outside of that form. But I mean, it's still an important thought. And that's what I love about the Daodejing. I mean, it is radical. And so I think it's good to at least recognize that the form of life that we embody today, which might seem so natural and necessary and inevitable, might not be so. And it's good to sort of step back and reflect on whether or not all this stuff, that society and culture has sort of thrown at us and that we've been so immersed in. And really, there's not that much we can do anymore, I suppose, especially when you're 42 like me. But still, like when I talk about the Daodejing with my students, and I do bring up that distinction between natural and acquired desires, I do get the sense that some of them start thinking about how much of their desires and values and what they like or dislike has been shaped by external forces that are not of them, And nobody really likes to be just externally controlled or manipulated. I think we all prize some autonomy and some authenticity. And so if we think that, oh, wait, all these desires I have are just simply the products of these external forces, there's something troubling about that. So I think the Daodejing, there's a core theme that runs throughout the text that kind of keeps drawing our attention to that part of our lives, which is even more, I think, weighty today and more influential.
Yeah. There's an example I read once way back as an undergraduate. I think it might have been from Peter Singer of all people, but I'm not sure. That's meant to illustrate how in certain social contexts, when people sort of collectively start desiring some new thing, that can come as a net loss. And his example was deodorant, So anyway, most people live in cultures where other people bathe about as much as they do. And it's not, if someone's really odorific, they're noisome, they smell really strongly, that's not a problem because everyone's kind of used to it, accustomed to it. They don't even notice it in a way. And then along comes someone who invents this new thing, deodorant, that some people use. Now the people who are wearing the deodorant kind of implicitly hold everyone else to a higher standard so that they also have to wear deodorant. Now you have a new so-called daily need. You have this new product that everyone now has to buy and regularly apply and so on. And the question is, has it really improved everyone? No, not really. It seems like there's just this kind of the effect of competition or conspicuous consumption or something has made everyone sort of develop a new need or desire for deodorant when in fact it was addressing a problem that didn't really exist in the first place, Anyway, yeah, there are lots of ways of illustrating how it is that acquired desires can come at a net loss for people. That's one of them. Yeah, so interestingly, the Daodejing, although it seems to be sort of worried about the acquisition of desires for a better life, this kind of grass is greener or moon is fuller on the other side phenomenon. As I read it, it does seem to endorse this idea that we do have desires, pre-existing desires, and that some of them are ones worth satisfying. And so we should seek a kind of contentment and satisfaction in the things that are available to us. And that's what the third section, section 3, that we're calling contentment and simplicity in daily life, is meant to illustrate.
Yeah. So we're in section 3 now. So I'll read the next part here. Make their food savory, their clothes fine, their houses comfortable, their lives happy. As you mentioned, Justin, so this part shows that, no, the Daodejing doesn't reject happiness and well-being. It's offering a different sort of model of contentment that's not dependent on novelty or luxury. And these descriptions of savory food, fine clothing, comfortable homes are modest, but considered sufficient for a happy life. And one concern I did have is, I don't know, clothes are, I've never made clothes with my bare hands, fortunately. But I would have imagined that that's extremely labor intensive, So I do worry a little bit about just how much time and effort would go into all this, making a house. But I guess this would be a simple house, right? And also I did wonder about this food savory part. So the savory, I think I looked at the classical Chinese like gan, so it can also mean like enjoy or
gan, sure.
And so savory, one thing I was wondering is when they say make their food savory, one way to make food good or savory is, you put all these new spices, and exotic, accoutrements on top. But I wonder if another thought here that they're going for is, look, food itself is good and it's enjoyable and pleasurable. And you just have to have the right attitude, So maybe part of it is, you can have savory food, but if you have the right, proper, moderated desires, the food will be great. And because you'll appreciate it and it will be savory in the sense that it will be enjoyable. And in fact, I think there is this kind of like virtue ethical line about how moderated pleasures are the most pleasurable of all. And because they're like enjoyable in themselves. And so it's actually those the people who are temperate who enjoy the most from like drinking or eating.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Richard. So looking at the Chinese text here, I'll read the lines again. Make their food savory, their clothes fine, their houses comfortable, their lives happy. So in Chinese, as you said, the make their food savory is gan qi shi. And then each line actually takes essentially an adjective and then adds this word qi, this essentially a possessive pronoun, and then follows it with a noun. Sorry to geek out about the language here, but basically you're reading, Richard, well, maybe it's not make their food savory, but like learn to savor their food or something like that.
Right.
And that's also a defensible reading of the text. So basically there are two different things you can do with adjectives, or sometimes verbal adjectives, they're called, in classical Chinese. You can read them in the causative sense, where they actually turn the object into the adjective, so that you actually make the food savory. You actually convert the food into savory food. But you can also read it in the putative sense, where you regard, putative means like sort of how you regard the object, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you could regard the food as savory. You learn to kind of relish the food. Sometimes I noticed in meditation classes, they like to pass out these raisins and have everyone kind of mindfully, in a present state of mind, close their eyes and eat the raisin and notice how this thing that they've just sort of taken for granted is actually quite juicy and delicious and sweet in ways you didn't notice before. That's an example of sort of relishing the food, approaching the food with this savory attitude, regarding it as savory. So I think we could say this, quite arguably, the Taoist text is usefully ambiguous, poetically, we might say, ambiguous. It's like meant to be read in both ways. So it could be that both that the food itself is supposed to be made savory, but also people are supposed to regard it as savory and thus enjoy it more, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I agree with you. It's not a rejection of well-being. It's not like, I mean, I guess there's kind of a caricature of Taoist texts, Taoists in general, as radical ascetics, you know, people who want to deny themselves basic goods, or radical self-abnegationists, people who want to eliminate all desires and attachments. And that's clearly not the picture, I think, endorsed here. People are encouraged to indulge in certain basic pleasures. It's just that they should indulge in the pleasures that are kind of naturally and readily available to them, right? And available to them in this kind of simple agrarian community.
And more so, if you have the right attitude and the right desires, you might enjoy them even more. I mean, you know, if you're just like rushing, you know, and you can't even maybe taste the really great cuisine, right? I mean, this happens to all of us, right? We just lose the perspective and then we can't appreciate even what is supposed to be like a gourmet cuisine. But if you have the right kind of outlook and the grateful kind of sensibility, then, you know, you could really enjoy that apple. Just a regular apple can become like this incredible, you know, delicious piece of food. Yeah, there's, I think, quite a lot here about the reshaping of attitude and how that can lead to even greater joy and pleasures.
Yeah, nicely put. Maybe we'll circle back to this at the end when we talk about some of the kind of takeaways from this text. But I think for the sake of finishing the discussion, we should read the fourth section, which for me is such a evocative one. So this is section 4. We're calling it Radical Localism and Peace. So I said earlier that there's a way of reading this text. It's a pretty standard way. A lot of people read it this way, is sort of calling back to a time in Chinese history, even before really kind of many of the advantages of civilization as they knew it were available, when states themselves, whole countries in a way, were just these tiny, were confined more or less to these little communities that were all living relatively independently of one another. And so here's the description of that time. So we're going to call it kind of radical localism and the peace that is a consequence of that localism. So here it is. Then, even though neighboring states are within sight of each other, even though they can hear the sounds of each other's dogs and chickens, their people will grow old and die without ever having visited one another. I don't know about you, but even the first time I heard this line, I had an image in my head of people living in one sort of community collection of huts and houses and farm and fields and such, and gazing across the fields or maybe across the river and seeing some other houses, some roofs of those houses at a great distance, hearing their dogs barking, hearing their chickens call out, and probably thinking, I wonder what their life is like, but not having an inclination to go over and visit them. And that passage for me is just so, I don't know, it's just so beautiful, compelling, vivid, that I think it taps into something kind of deep in the human psyche, because those lines are the ones that you most often see in other texts, including, I mentioned before, chapter 10 of the Zhuangzi, another utopian chapter. It more or less paraphrases that line. Yeah, so the idea is it's describing a community that is geographically close to other communities, but socially and culturally and economically independent of those. And that might seem like a kind of way of life that people are living that's sort of impoverished in a way because they're not aware of these other communities. They're aware of them, right? That's the interesting part, right? They know of their existence, but they don't know much about them. But there are some big advantages, right? There's no war. No state has the aspiration to expand or, kind of gain more material wealth by trading with other communities. So it avoids a lot of those sources of conflict and instability that are so hobbling and impairing the quality of life that people in warring states China experienced at the time that this text was written.
And they're already so satisfied. They have no desire to go visit these neighboring states.
Yeah.
There isn't the kind of competitiveness and acquiescentiveness, right? And they don't have that desire to keep trying to make their lives better and better and kind of compare themselves also, with neighboring states and how populous they are and so on. One thing that was striking to me is, we live in a completely opposite, like such a different world, right? Because we're like so globalized, we're so multicultural. We're also like, our lives are so embedded within this extremely larger community. And especially in the digital age, we could see how people live. Sometimes I used to live in South Korea for a while, and most of my relatives are still there. So, there's on YouTube, you can watch people, they just like record like 6 hours of just walking around Seoul, and they're just like walking around these busy streets. And you can actually see almost any major city. Like you can, like someone's filming somewhere in Brazil or somewhere in Shanghai. Like, there's just, you could basically, get a sense of like how people live in so many ways. And there's this idea that I mentioned at one point, Justin, called hyperculture. So I really like this idea. I think it's super interesting, by Byung-Chul Han. So he's this Korean German philosopher.
I'll spell it for our listeners. Byungchul, Byung-Chul, and then Han, Han. Yeah.
Yep. Byung-Chul Han. And he has a lot of short little books, and they draw quite a bit on like Heidegger and continental philosophy that I'm not as familiar with. So it's a little bit tough for me to like absorb all of it. But the core ideas he explores are just so fascinating. And one of them is that we live in this hyperculture where we've kind of lost a sense of like rootedness. And we live in a world where it seems like we're boundless. There's no limitations. The vivid image and kind of slightly comical images, we're all like tourists in Hawaiian shirts, and and I just have that image. It's like so real. And, I think I've been one of them at some point and somewhere. We kind of, marvel, and we kind of appreciate a little bit. You try a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
We're tourists in Hawaiian shirts visiting all these different international restaurants, right? Like
exactly. Eating fusion food, by the way, like Polish, Korean hot dog. And actually, he does talk about fusion cuisine as kind of a paradigmatic example. And I don't know what to make of it. I'm kind of torn a little bit. I find it to be also beautiful that we live and have awareness of and access to all these different cultures. But at the same time, I guess he is kind of suggesting that we lose ourselves in some sense. Like we're no longer settled. There's no like specific location that we really belong to, it seems. So I think he's exploring these ideas. He's not just like poo-pooing all that, of everything of the modern world. But he is noticing that we also do lose something.
Yeah, that's right. So actually, Richard was the one who came up with the section titles for today's discussion, and he was the one who chose radical localism for this last section. I think that's exactly right. So the people living in this Daoist utopia are radically local. That is, they're very much of their own culture. They're not participants in hyperculture, and they're not trying to. It's interesting, actually. It's insofar as the chapter is an illustration of people learning to be content with what they have and not acquire new desires. And by the way, the traditional commentaries do seem to read this as very much about that kind of freedom from desire, even though the word desire itself never appears anywhere in the passage. All of the kind of the most influential traditional commentaries that I looked at for today's discussion all read it as very much about being free of, or being sort of lacking the problematic desires completely. What's interesting about it to me is that they characterize this freedom from desire in a way that might be a little surprising to some. So the idea seems to be you learn to be content with what you have, not because you haven't even imagined a better life, or you're not even aware of a better life, but because your contentment with what you have is so deep that you don't crave these better lives, even though you're aware of their possibility, right? So the idea roughly is something like this. You can imagine sort of a distinction between two kinds of contentment. There's a contentment from ignorance about better possibilities, and there's a contentment despite knowledge of better possibilities. And what's really striking about this chapter is that it's consistently saying, oh, no, people who live in these communities do have knowledge of better and thus other possibilities. It's not like they don't know that there's another side of the fence where the grass might be greener. or that they don't know that there are these other countries where the moon might shine more fully,
Mm-hmm.
They do know it. And presumably, because after all, they hear the dogs and chickens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Moreover, they do know that there are these labor-saving tools, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that
Right.
there
They
are
have
these,
them.
yeah, that's right. They have them, right? They're just sitting like they're moldering, I guess, in a barn or something.
Mm-hmm.
And they also have these carts and boats that they don't use.
Yeah. Yep.
And so that's, for me, is really interesting because it suggests that the kind of contentment that they're enjoying is this deep contentment, which they learn to relish and savor despite the fact that there may be these temptations. So here's where we can kind of like reconnect, I think, in a way, the passage to our opening discussion about you and me, the two of us in 2025 living at the precipice of this
AI revolution.
oh yeah, this AI revolution, right? And at the beginning of this period where everyone has this constant source of distraction. So there were two ways of handling that in the great age of distraction, technological distraction. There are two ways of handling these temptations to go watch YouTube videos or was it Instagram, TikTok videos, and what have you. And one is to return somehow to a state of ignorance where you're not even aware that they exist.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a temptation to read the Taoist text as recommending that people live that way. Presumably, one of the reasons people are better off not having access to written work is because they won't then spend lots of time imagining a better life. But in fact, I think the way to read the text is different. It's suggesting that they have such deep contentment with what they already have that even though they know of the existence of these other possibilities, these better possibilities, they don't desire them. So, I mean, the traditional commentaries, two of them, the Heshang commentary and the Wang Bi commentary, which are kind of the two most influential ones, both conclude this chapter by saying something like, and this is a state of being without desire or not having anything to desire to pursue.
Yeah,
And
and
I
I
feel
think
like,
that idea of like them knowing and still not using is
yeah,
actually it is really important. And the Amish actually see this. There's this term. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right. It's something like rumspringa. Have you heard of this term,
yes,
Justin?
yes.
Yeah, it's where they're around like sometime in adolescence, maybe when they're 16 or so, they're allowed to go out of the Amish community for like, I'm not sure, maybe a year or two. They're actually allowed to like go on with their life. Like they don't have to come back. They can drive cars, they can date non-Amish people and so on. But
Can they
most of them
drink?
do come back. Yeah, they're
Yeah.
allowed to drink and they get to, party it up and see what life is like out there, I guess. But most of them, from what I know, do end coming back to the Amish community. But I guess they do also value this idea that it's good for them to also have knowledge of what the world is like and what they're missing out on.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a definite thread in the Daodejing which holds in high esteem or prizes a state of mind, a kind of psychological state where you are aware of better possibilities and yet are so content with what you have that you aren't truly tempted to pursue those better possibilities. There's actually another chapter in the Daodejing, 71, I think it is, which goes something like, just as I've made a distinction between a kind of enlightened contentment and contentment out of ignorance, there's another passage that makes the distinction between enlightened ignorance and naive ignorance. So it's something like to know that one does not know, that's the highest form of knowledge. And that's compared favorably with something that it calls not knowing, but believing that one does know. And then presumably there's a third kind of knowledge, which is not knowing and not even being aware that you don't know, sort of naive ignorance. Anyway, the point is, in chapter 71, it says it's an advantage to realize that you're ignorant. It compares that to sort of seeing your disease as a disease. Sages are free of this disease because they're aware of their own ignorance. So there's something kind of liberating in knowing that you don't know. Similarly, there's something liberating about knowing that there could be, in some respects, a life that is quote unquote better for you, and yet being content with what you have. That's preferable to just sort of living in a state of ignorance about these other possibilities. It's really striking. Yeah. Yeah. So that's one of the major themes of this really important passage, desire. I've tried to suggest that traditional commentators read this whole chapter as sort of describing people who live in a state without certain kinds of desires, without acquired desires, free of desires in some respect. But there's another theme which I wanted to discuss briefly, Richard, if we have time, which is utopianism. We've described this, at least for purposes of kind of having a shorthand for the chapter, as a Daoist utopia. And then I mentioned briefly, there's also this term utopianism, which is used to describe, usually it's a pejorative term, right? It's used to describe the wrong approach to social reform, where you're just kind of positing that there's this ideal state and then not worrying enough about whether it's realistic or whether there are sort of reasonable means to get there, right? And just sort of superimposing utopian vision of society on people. Think of like Robespierre and the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution, which was so disastrous. So the question is this a utopian vision? Are the Daoist authors of this passage basically foisting upon people an extremely unrealistic vision, which is not worth pursuing? Are they the bad kind of utopian? Or are they just sort of like benign dreamers who are offering an ideal that's somehow informative and worth aspiring to, so long as you take it in stride and strive for it? It's somehow realistic that we could get there by a stepwise manner, or at least approach it in a way that would improve our lives, right? That's an interesting question for me. And it's interesting in part because I've spent some time looking at the traditional commentaries, which I have to say downplay the radicalism of the passage. So everything that we've been talking about, like whether people have and nevertheless not use their labor-saving tools, many of the traditional commentaries try to sort of interpret that line differently. For example, the Heshang Gong commentary, which is sometimes known as the earliest and most kind of religious commentary, reads it as having agricultural tools that aren't pressed into service by the ruler, And so the assumption seems to be that people can still use these labor-saving tools. It's just that they're not being reappropriated by the ruler for his own personal purposes. Anyway, that's just one example among many that I found. Even this idea of shrinking the state and lessening the population, I find the traditional commentators try to downplay that. So they must have thought, oh, that's unrealistic. So we have to now reinterpret that as a line about the attitude that the ruler has toward his state. He regards it as though it were a small state, And then there's one commentator, Cheng Shenying from the Tang Dynasty, who basically reads the whole chapter as an extended metaphor for your kind of personal journey to enlightenment. So all the stuff about boats and carts, are really describing the vehicles that you take to achieve enlightenment. And so, yeah, the point is that if you find this unrealistic nowadays, you're not alone. Historically speaking, many traditional commentators have also found it to be unrealistic. And for that reason, they've downplayed the so-called utopianism in the text.
I mean, we do know that there have been people who shared this attitude. And the most famous work that comes to my mind is Walden, right, by Henry David Thoreau. And I guess there's a kind of general line in the Romantics, right, or the Romantic period, a kind of return to nature. And I have no idea if Thoreau read any of the Taoist texts. Are you aware of that, Justin? I don't know.
Yes. So I'm not a specialist in the transcendentalists and so-called American philosophy, but I remember I TA'd once for someone who assigned Walden, and we certainly read lines from the Mencius. So yeah, I think they had access to those early translations of the Chinese classics. They must have read Taoist texts too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Thoreau definitely thinks lives of quiet desperation, he says, right? And he thinks that modern society and culture has really destroyed many of the important sensibilities of human beings. And so he thinks it's better to live a much more simple life. And so, I think he would read this and go, yeah, no, it's maybe not easy, but he would say, this is a vision worth striving for. I must say today, for most of us, given human psychology, I mean, we're brought up from, it's like the bottle, like a baby, being suckered on, all this knowledge. I mean, I think I'm hopeless. I don't think I can quite, let go of all this. But that doesn't mean, of course, there's not a lot to learn and a lot to ponder and reflect on. There's a lot of, I think, important wisdom here to think about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it this way before, Richard, but there's an interesting debate to be had here, interpretive debate about this chapter. So I've been characterizing this chapter as describing people who are content with what they have and thus don't fall into this trap of wanting a life better than one that's already available to them. So who don't suffer from the grass is always greener syndrome, or the foreign moon is always rounder or fuller syndrome. And we've been sort of speaking as though that way of life where you don't fall into that trap, it goes hand in hand with the simple agrarian utopia or the primitive agrarian utopia, right? But the question is that way of life somehow detachable? Is that ideal somehow detachable? So that you can learn to be content with what you have, whatever that happens to be, right? So for those of us who can take for granted that we'll always have smartphones or something, can we learn to be content with that, right? That we'll always have reading and writing, have access to great volumes of words, and so on.
I see.
Yeah. I have to say there's a certain reading of Daoist texts according to which the way of life that it recommends, it's recommending it to us not just because it's what we already have and what we have reliable access to, but also because it's natural, because it somehow better accords with our nature, And it's much harder to argue that smartphones and Instagram and TikTok videos and that sort of thing accord with are somehow natural in the same way. So, but maybe there is a way of sort of revising, creating a kind of new iteration of this ideal. What we're supposed to be content with is the stuff that we already have. And we can learn to do that somehow. Yeah.
I mentioned this. I guess I should bring it up because I think there's this incredible parallel here with a moment in Plato's Republic where Socrates sketches out this healthy city, he says, and it basically just amounts to satisfying basic needs. This comes in Book 2 of the Republic. And then one of his interlocutors, Glaucon, who actually, as I remember him, he has some more darker impulses and desires
definitely
flowing through him. A really interesting character. But Glaucon objects and says, but Socrates, where's the perfume? Where's the goods? Where's the couches? Where,
the comfortable couches.
And I want to be comfortable, man. Like, where's the air conditioner, we might say. Yeah, and actually, Socrates says, okay, well, all right, I understand. He gets it, and he says, well, if you want that stuff, then we got to move outside of the healthy city and go toward what he calls a feverish city, where you need more land, you need more labor, and you need to start guarding your stuff. So you need like a military. So we quickly move into the zone of possible violence, warfare, and so on. But it seems like, actually, as I remember from the text, which I haven't read in like over 10 years, Socrates thinks, the healthy city might be much closer to this Daodejing chapter 80 vision.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I think you and I and many of our listeners take it for granted that it's not possible, it's not really feasible for them to return to a state that's of the sort that's described in Daodejing chapter 80, or for that matter, in Plato's Republic, the kind of ideal city as opposed to the feverish city. But that doesn't mean that we just sort of dismiss these texts altogether. We still have a kind of picture of the human good and of human psychology that we have to deal with, and we have to sort of figure out what we're going to do about it, And so I've tried to suggest that there's this deep critique of acquired desires where they basically all come at a net loss. And then you've suggested, Richard, and I think a lot of people who read this text would agree, that there's this kind of pervasive sense that there's a trap that we're trying to avoid, that this ideal society is meant to help people avoid, which is the trap of yearning for a life that's better than the one that they already have. Because once you've fallen into the trap, then you've committed yourselves to pursuits that are insatiable, where you'll never be satisfied, because once you get that better life, you'll still be dreaming of a still better life, of even more ways of saving labor and time. Yeah, so that's a weighty matter. And I think we have to sort of figure out whether we accept that picture of human psychology and of the human good. And if we do, then what do we do about it,
Yeah. And I guess what's tough is in our culture, I think it is pretty consumeristic, right? And I'm not, I guess I don't think of myself as Marxist, but I see the critiques of capitalism. I think capitalism has done some good for the world, but also there's
and consumerism,
and consumerism kind of goes together and also forms our desires, and I think does kind of create in us this desire, this pursuit of increasing wealth and profit and material benefit. And so I think that is actually can be quite harmful down the road, especially as we get things that are sufficiently satisfying. I mean, lives for a lot of us are pretty good, but yet we're still chasing. And I think we should think long and hard about these texts, because they might suggest actually you have everything you need and to really enjoy your life. And And you got to really think through whether some of those desires are actually for any good end.
Yes, right. Yeah, exactly. So another theme that comes up often in the context of the Daodejing and other early Chinese texts is the great advantages of knowing what counts as enough. 知足 is the sort of expression in classical Chinese, to know enough, right? To know the point of sufficiency or something. And so that clearly is in the background of this passage. And I mention it in part because I feel like maybe we should apply the same rule with respect to this episode.
And say, yes.
Yeah, so we've had a chance to introduce people to this important passage. I hope it'll stick with you. It really has stuck with me, especially that image of the communities that live close enough to one another that they can hear each other's dogs and chickens, but yet never interact with each other. I'm fascinated with it, you know? I'm assuming that people who live in that time must have been curious about what life was like for people on the other side of the river or over those fields, you know, through the woods or what have you. And yet they somehow knew that they had enough, right? They're exemplars of this kind of sufficiency and self-awareness of sufficiency.
The life of the hobbits, you know, comes to my mind.
Yes,
they just seem so content. They smoke a little bit of weed, right?
Yeah,
They drink some beer, and they just hang out, and they're quite happy, you know, with what they have. Yeah, that's a kind of leisurely ideal that I think we should all really think more about.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe that's the takeaway. And anyway, that's the lesson that we'll try to apply to this episode as well. So we'll say that's enough for today. And that was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.